I am Neha and I'm the developer advocate at Zyte. And I'm super excited to bring you the new series. I'm back with a webinar series, super excited to do it. This time, the entire series is dedicated to web scraping maturity model. I want to welcome James. James is the co-creator of a web scraping maturity model himself. James is a senior product manager responsible for Zyte's data business. He collaborates with clients and our internal teams to make the acquisition of reliable and high quality web data both seamless and commercially attractive. It's always fascinating how James shares stories of clients extracting value from web data. James, it's great to have you with us today.
Oh, thanks, Naya. Pleasure to be here. Actually, when Naya asked me to do up a short bio, the first bullet point was a bit depressing. It seems I'm a product manager 15 years now. Just doesn't feel that long. But I'm a previous company founder as well. So from the startup world, and actually, I suppose in some ways I'm quite similar to yourselves in that I was previously a prospect of Zyte. So I was working at a company where, believe it or not, we had 30 people who visited websites and copy and pasted information from the websites. Now, it was to inform, it was to tracking legal and regulatory developments. And I happened to come across Shane, who's the CEO of Zyte, at an entrepreneur event, and I was like, wow, this sounds like magic. This could completely transform the business. And started working with them, and yeah, I must say I was blown away and really could see it as, yeah, this is the future. The amount of data is just expanding exponentially, and with all the improvements in AI, this is just, you know, this is the golden road. So I jumped on board with Zyte there just over 2 years ago, and yeah, it's been an incredible journey since, and especially the fact that I suppose we're so close to our customers, work so close with them. That's just it's a dream for product managers. And you were asked, Naya, for some interesting fact about myself. I suppose if you want to call it a hobby, main hobby would be reading business books. Just find them fascinating, looking for new insights and ideas, and trying to stay up on new ideas and find ways to bring them into the business if at all possible.
Nice. So I know you mentioned to me like you are an avid business book reader, and should I say listener,
Yeah, audiobook, sorry, yeah. I don't have time to sit down and read. But, yeah,
so which one resonates with you the most?
One that is quite relevant, I would say, to most people on this call, it would be on the webinar side. It would be How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. It is absolutely fascinating read. It just two main things it teaches you, and this might go contrary to what you think is Zyte's business case, but you need less data than you think, and you have more data than you think. It's an absolutely brilliant book about how to make, especially commercial decisions, how to get data, and kind of debunks the whole statistically significant side of things. But yeah, it's definitely How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. Best book ever.
And has it influenced web scraping maturity model as well?
Yeah, oh, definitely in terms of doing the research and the samples and the sample sizes, and to make inferences based on the sample sizes we had, based on kind of confidence intervals, how confident are we in this information, how representative is it, and taking a pragmatic approach to data. For example, a simple example, and again this applies to data. An alien lands on Earth. They see a monkey, and then they're asked, well, how big are monkeys? It's like, well, I've seen one, so I've only one data point, but the odds are, they're not going to go down to the microbe side, and they're not going to go up to the size of houses. So even one data point can be quite informative. And it's how, again, within context, and there's lots more in the book to explain that, but you'd be surprised how much you can infer from not as much data as you need. Now, it depends on it, and we'll go into details later on where you absolutely need one specific bit of information to make a specific decision, and that's a bit different. So it's when you're looking for inferences and sample sizes, and especially at the early stages of business cases and web scraping projects.
Wow, I have lots of questions running on my head. Especially with one data point, you can extract so much of an information. Must be an outlier. When thank you all for joining in. I think let's not I'll come back to the center, and we'll start the session. And we have a lot of people joining in today from Germany, Argentina, Denmark, and we have users of SPM as well. So thank you all for joining in, and let's just get started. You know, so first, James, during your research of maturity model, you have gathered like substantial information on why certain projects don't succeed,
Yeah.
right? Can you shed some light on those aspects?
Yeah, and kind of deliberately starting with this because there's a few shock points in here and a few things that are quite surprising. And deliberately title this when data projects fail, not when web scraping projects fail, because web scraping, it's a means to an end. You know, having the web scraping on its own, that's not the business benefit. That will enable a later business benefit, be it a decision point or feeding into a product. But from, I suppose, talking to, when we were doing this research, talking to different interviewees, it was trying to understand, originally when we were going out, we were trying to find out what does good look like. But you have to have two sides of that coin. So we also have to look at, well, what does bad look like, you know, in case we're doing it or in case we see clients do it and we can help them avoid some of those pitfalls. So we're trying to find out, you know, what's the most common reason things fail. And we were going in there with expectations of, oh, it's because of bans, or it's because of, oh, we found it hard to match the data, or data processing was very expensive, or honestly, we were going in expecting those type of feedback. But the feedback we were getting was, oh yeah, we didn't realize the value that we thought we would when we got the data going, which was quite surprising. Especially, I suppose, for us, because, you know, our business are two sides to it. We have the software side, where clients use our software to get data, and then there's our delivery side, where we use our software to get data for clients. So we're serving that need. We're providing the data all the time, but it was, which was also quite interesting, because in parallel to our research that we're doing here, as a product manager, you always do kind of research with your own customer base, and a customer segment that's of particular interest are your churned customers. So the one that's left. So we really want to talk to them to understand, look, what did we do wrong? What could we do better? What lessons could we take from this? And we get lots of different feedback, but the most predominant feedback on the data side was we didn't see the value we expected. So it wasn't bans, it wasn't price or cost, it was we just didn't experience the value, which really was triggered in our heads. It's like, hang on, you've spent a lot of money, either internally your own developers and QA, or externally on with companies like Zyte to actually get this data, set it up, process it, clean it, and then it didn't work out for you. Like,
Yeah.
that's you know, it's not good, it's not great, it's not, even though for us we do some web scraping and we drive some volume, but then it stops. That's not what we want. You know, we want a customer for life. We don't want them to come and go, and the best way to do that is to help them be successful. So we really want to understand, well, why are these things failing? And we could just kind of write it off, well, like that's their own internal business IP, it's their own, it's specific to each industry, each data type. We can't really help with that. But it turns out there were a good few commonalities in terms of when we started to dig into the failures, in so much as we could. Obviously, when you're on a call, you know, we can't go too deep on people's dirty linen, want a better description, but there were some good broad strokes there in terms of why things didn't work out. And some of it you'll see in the structure of a company in terms of how for example, the web scraping or the data that needs to be provided, how that's acquired and how it's actually rolled into the organization. And if you're very siloed areas where web scraping is done over here, data analysis is over here, and then the commercial realization is over here, if they're not connected, it's basically like any product. So if you have a software product where developers are working very hard, but not actually really connected to the end user through the product manager, typically, if that connection is not there, you're not going to have a successful product. So these data projects, they're like mini products, unless the developers, people actually building it, really understand what the commercial people are trying to achieve. Often they just wouldn't meet. And sometimes it was expectations didn't meet. The commercial people might assume, okay, well, going to a website for information, it's like looking up a database. It's quite easy. It's not as simple as that, or not all websites have the same information. Not all websites within e-commerce have the same structure. Not only that, the structure keeps changing. New fields come in, fields move around on a page. So imagine trying to query a database where the column titles are changing, rows are changing, information is changing within cells. It's quite a dynamic environment, and unless you're in that world yourself, like the developers are, you won't know that. The commercial people might not know that. So yeah, I suppose backing up a bit, what we really noticed was there were no bodies. bodies were not very visible. And by that I mean, that's a bit of a grim way of putting it, but actually it's from Douglas Hubbard's book about Visit the Graveyard. You know, what failed, why did it fail? And if these failures aren't obvious, if they're not tracked, if lessons aren't learned from them, then it'll repeat. Another project will fail. So if you don't extract the learnings from these failed projects, the same thing will happen again and again. And it needs to be visible. Work needs to be visible, failures need to be visible. And that's where this graphic came for here. Because to set these data feeds up, you need to make an initial investment, be it with your own developers, and that could be slowly over time, or it could be an external company like ourselves, where the investment is upfront and quickly, and you get a return quick, but it is still an investment. And then you start seeing a return. And we were seeing projects being cancelled, being abandoned. Obviously, some were working, quite a lot of them were working, but still much more were failing than we expected. And we'd one prospect there recently who came to us saying they'd set up e-commerce again. They'd set up 10 feeds there 3 years ago, but some of them have been broken for 1 to 2 years, but they're not too sure how long.
Yeah. So basically, like it's just like feeling like what failure look like, right?
Effectively, yeah.
Feeling it fully. And I think that's the intangible which not many people talk about and straight away get into jumping. But then like, from inception to final form of web scraping maturity model, right? The journey behind web scraping maturity model must be filled with a lot of insights and discoveries, as you're mentioning, of course, right? But how did the idea come about, and how you consolidated the findings into the model that we see today? Like, especially that, like, how did you consolidated all of this information in the model?
Yeah, so I suppose we didn't go out to build a maturity model. We went out to really research initially what is it that we're doing well, so we can maybe incorporate more of that into our marketing material. That's the honest what we started out doing. But we started getting more and more information. We started getting more into depth to it with individuals, and we hired an external agency to actually coordinate the interview process. So it would be external, so we wouldn't be biased by just our customers or people who maybe already had a good opinion of us or a good experience with us. We wanted a broad cross section of people. We talked with 40 different organizations for the main body of research. There was some validation afterwards, but so they recruited them. They didn't know they were talking to Zyte. So we kept it all very neutral. We went through our standard questionnaires, and we're getting this feedback, and every interview you come back with 15, 10, 20 different points, interesting nuggets. And we were trying to, I suppose, form them on the headings, like where were the issues? The issues were in maintenance and scaling. Maybe they were in compliance. Some were in the build, but not that many. People were quite good at building spiders, maybe not so good at maintaining them or making sure they were legally compliant. But definitely the weakest area overall was on the kind of eventually the planning, which typically is the business case. And, what is the business benefit? Will we get the business benefit? It was very much a heavy focus on, can we build a spider? Can we get past the anti-bans? Can we get this data? And I was like, sure you can. You'll definitely find someone who can, but should you? Or what's the right amount? And we'll dig into some kind of really tangible examples later on as to what that is. So yeah, we started to collate things with a virtual whiteboard and putting all our notes in, because there was a few of us involved in it, which is by one of the co-creators. And I suppose it started to coalesce around 4 or 5 headings. And obviously we were working with our own teams as well, internally, and especially the customer facing. What issues were they seeing? What were we doing well? What worked well? Why did they come to us? And often was around kind of scaling and maintaining the quality as well, not to mention the actual constant data feed. And then we coalesced around these headings, and then I was trying to break it up into kind of different levels of performance, like what does good look like? What does amazing look like? And it's not that it's everyone should be at the highest level. Everyone should be proactive. It's much more nuanced and complex than that, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. But at least, I suppose, we found with the model, it helped us. We then went back after it, once we had the first iteration of the model, we retained the agency again to go back out. Okay, look, let's validate this with 10 different organizations. Does this match their reality, or is this just not that interesting? As it turned out, it really helped people. It helped kind of frame, I suppose, the data projects, especially as it relates to web data. And what were they doing well? What could they do better? What are they not aware of? And it really is all depended on where the organization was on their maturity journey, how, if they were a digital native or not, if they were a data first type company, how they, I suppose, performed on it, and what they had to think about, and where they wanted to get to as well was really important. And obviously, companies that built products on top of the data, they were really, really keen, because their livelihood, their salaries, their income just relied on the web scraping going well, because that's what powered their tools. So they were up in the most advanced level, I suppose. Does that answer your question now?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I really want to run a poll now and ask the audience, like, what's the most significant pain points in the room? So launch the poll. Make sure you participate and let us know what's the most significant pain points, right, that you are solving today in your web scraping projects. And while I'm running the poll, James, can you just take us to the next slide and share the final results of the model with us and explain its significance. And also, I want to, oh, we've gotten the results from the poll. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll share the results of the poll. I'm not sure if you are able to see it on the screen as of now, but yeah. If you're James has done a detailed video on explaining the details of web scraping maturity model, all the dimensions in detail. And in webinars, we are not trying to cover as much theory around the dimensions, but we are talking more of the tangibles part and what you can do to level up your maturity level. So if you do want to check that out, please go ahead and watch that. I'm going to share the link in the chat window. Kleber is on the back seat and helping us with this webinar. Kleber, if you can share the link to the self-assessment and the detailed explanation of the video for the audience to watch, you can just share it in the chat window, please. We're I'm almost close to ending the poll now. And that's it. And James, can you switch on to the web scraping maturity model and explain the final results and the graph that we are seeing today on the screen and explain its significance?
Yeah, you can see the model now with the benchmark on it, I presume.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Excellent. That's great. So this is in this model, we've stripped out all the text just to make it a bit easier. And the benchmark is kind of what we saw from the 40 organizations plus the 10 afterwards for validation purposes. What the average score was, and no big surprises here in that people were quite good at building quality because they had defined teams who were good developers. They were doing this all the time. They were experts in it. Of course, they were going to be good at it. And that's the go-to. It's kind of like, well, let's get some web data. Great, let's get a developer who can do web scraping. But the other parts then, particularly around compliance, so like, have you done your compliance assessment? And as much as we'd all live in a alternative universe where that's not required, it really is required. For those of you who've received a cease and desist, it really is required. But again, always seen very light on the planning side. Now this benchmark here, that's an average. Now what we did see is there really was two groupings. There were those, as I mentioned, like the digital natives, the data first companies whose they built a product on top of the web data feeds. They were all at a much higher level of maturity, and then everyone else was at a lower level. So we had kind of two clusters, but the pattern was very much the same. While some more mature organizations, they would be better compared to other organizations as regards to business planning because they had to be. It was still relatively lighter than it was around the build side because there was a very much big focus on the build side. Now, we would say during our interview process, we interviewed people on the development side, on the commercial side, on the data science side. That was part of the remit for the external agency, that we want a cross-spread of the different stakeholders inside companies around web data. So that is the overall pattern. Again, quite light on the planning and design side. Also on the compliance side, legal compliance, it's not just legal compliance, quite good on the build and not too bad on the scaling and maintenance, but that was always kind of a build first and worry about maintaining later type. Was definitely a trend that we saw. So today, as I mentioned, we'll have a webinar series and usually these columns, but today we're focusing on the planning and design. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's not about everyone should be proactive at level 4. It's more nuanced than that. Sorry. So if we look at on the ad hoc side, so this would be reactive, no business cases, no existing tech stack. I'm moving all the way up. No big revelations here. Opportunistic is okay. Basically back at the envelope napkin type planning, maybe inconsistent data stack. You're using Scrapy over here, using JavaScript over here to get the information. Analysis and spreadsheets. And as you get more systematic, then you're starting to have some form of business cases, particularly for larger data feeds and consistent technology stack and BI tools being leveraged and then at the proactive side. And these are only samples. Within the actual full model, there's much more detail, and you'll see that in the other webinar as well that Clever linked to.
Yeah.
But sorry now.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, like, so planning and design, right? It stands out as a foundational pillar in the model. And can you, I'm quite curious to know, like, how it shapes the overall framework, right?
Yeah, I mean, we put it first on the left in the matrix on purpose, because it's what you should do first. It's what you should do before you do any coding, before you go out and do any purchasing or getting quotes. Or for web scraping, it's almost safe to assume you can get the data. You may not be very sure exactly how much it might cost, but start off with assuming you can get it. And there's much more uncertainty around, well, can we get the benefit out of this data? And to give a few examples, I'll just give you examples, I suppose. I mentioned already that not everyone's aiming for proactive, but within any one company, you can be at several different levels at once, because it depends on the business case, on the planning that's required. Because it's not a case of one size fits all as regards planning, because planning, there's a cost to actual business cases and ROI analysis. It's a cost to do it. There's an opportunity cost to that time as well, and the money that it takes, and it can slow things down when you're in a rapidly moving environment. So it's about having proportional analysis. And it could be that you have some data feeds that would be classified as ad hoc. A data scientist built it using a Chrome plugin and is doing the analysis. Well, I was going to say Excel, but a data scientist would never use Excel. But let's say, imagine they were. Now, and of course, you're thinking Chrome plugin, well, that'll get banned straight away. Yeah, it probably will. But it could be just a very simple one-off bit of disposable analysis of, okay, look, how many products in a particular category does my competitor have? And just doing a very simple discovery crawl to find out and do that count. Plus or minus 20% are probably more inaccurate. So it's about being proportionate in your analysis, because being proportionate to the costs of doing the work and the eventual benefits of it as well. So it's not okay. And I'm going into a bit more detail on the next slide on, like, what does a good business case look like? And then within the financial analysis, what does good financial analysis do? How do you, again, have a proportionate approach to the analysis? So to, again, you get maximum bang for your buck for your analysis, but there's also for your actual web scraping. To answer your question.
Yeah, so understanding one's position on maturity scale for planning and design is essential. We understand, right?
It's essential to understand it, but also to realize that you can be at several points in it at a time, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, the example I gave there, which is a quick bit of disposable analysis, it's perfectly fine for that to be ad hoc. We're not going to go back and look at it again. It's disposable. It doesn't need to be maintained. There's not going to be a lot of QA behind it. It's just very simple. Look, roughly how many products does this competitor have in this category, or multiple categories? And on as you move up the maturity model, particularly up towards, say, the proactive, where it's integrated. So we have clients or data feeds feed live into their platform, which actually updates prices in their platform. So there's no human between us and the prices on their websites being updated. And that's how, and at that stage, it needs to be absolutely bomb-proof. It needs to be rock solid, brilliant QA on top of it, really mature approach to it, very proactive. And by proactive, in this case, that would mean we'd have main data feeds running, and then we'd have redundancy backup data feeds running as well, where, okay, look, let's take a simple e-commerce example again. Here are the 30 fields you require from this field, and here's a separate spider that is powered by machine learning that will extract these other smaller subset of more important fields if the main one breaks, for example, or something changes, or if we're getting information from a particular endpoint and the endpoint changes, that there's also a backup as well. So that's at the really high mature level in terms of kind of the planning this all out. It's not just a case of we'll go there and get this data. It's like, well, okay, how important is you? How is it to you? What are the redundancies that you need to make sure you always get this data, or you always get the most important data?
That also brings me to two questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
First one is, like, how can businesses make more accurate assessments of their maturity model? Like, what are those tangibles, right? Can you talk more about those tangibles? And second is, like, what they need to do to upgrade their levels in the maturity model.
Yeah, so on the slide here, and Clever put the link into it there as well, a link to kind of self-assessment. And you can see in the self-assessment, it's not a case of what level do you think you are? Are you 1 or 4? Because as humans, we always think we're better than we are. You know, most 80% of people think they're better than average drivers, as an example. I'm making up percentages, but I'm sure you've heard the example. So we kind of try to ask.
Do you
try
have
to ask.
data to back that up?
I will have to get data and back that up. But basically, we have a more positive view of ourselves than maybe sometimes warranted. So the questions here, what we try to do when we're doing the online self-assessment, it had to be readily understandable, it had to be relatable, it had to be something that can kind of go, okay, yeah, we do that or don't do that. Not try to make it as reduced amount of subjectivity in it. And kind of looking for, you know, how many business cases have you done? How many business cases have been rejected? So when we were doing the actual interviews, we had a lot more time people. We had on the call with them. We never asked them about maturity. We asked them, okay, you know, do you do business cases? Yes, no. Okay, how many of them are rejected? It's like, oh, none. Is it really an evaluation tool where 100% of everything gets through it? It's probably not a very effective evaluation tool. So looking for those real, I suppose, data points as to, is this done? Are there business cases? Are they kept up to date? Are they reviewed? Once the data feed is up and running, is it does it go through a review process? Like there was a client I worked with, an e-commerce client, who were completely data first company. In fact, they consider themselves a data company before they consider themselves an e-commerce company. And they had like everything had to go through a business case. Everything was reviewed. With the business case, you also had to provide ongoing KPIs for a data feed to know that it was still continuing to deliver value. Because it could be in a, let's say, in a new product line comes out, the price intelligence around that might be very valuable and useful at the start, but then after a while, maybe that product line becomes more commoditized, more competitors come in there, and the price intelligence, you know, the price variations between competitors goes down, the value of the data feed goes down, and you start dropping down from daily crawls to weekly crawls to monthly crawls. So they continuous KPIs for data feeds, and they drop data feeds or scale back data feeds based on, you know, we're hitting that target or not. And it was very impressive company to see how they did this and how they approach it. Really commercial data first type approach, but they had the advantage of being kind of digital data natives right from the start. So they're at the higher level. These questions here on the screen, and they're also on the ones that Clever linked there. We tried to cut it back and kind of make it a bit easier and quicker to follow, but we're quite happy to get on a call and with people and kind of give through more tangible examples if you want to invest that time. And you might pick up some new ideas and tips and points around particular areas, again, for survey purposes, as well, so we could be consistent. We kind of have to simplify it a small bit. Does that answer your question, Anna?
Yeah, and before we move on, I just want to run another poll. Like there are 2 questions. I'm gonna launch the poll now, and you can see on your screens. So which statement most accurately describes the due diligence completed prior to building a new data feed? You can choose the option. There are 4 options. And the second question is, which statement most accurately describes the technology stack for supporting new data feed? And I'm going to give a couple of seconds on these 2 questions and let you assimilate like what we have talked about in the webinar. And it's quite clear, James, that content and like web scraping project needs planning and designing, right? Before you get into the coding part of it, before you start getting into the nitty-gritties of designing the code and getting that data, right? And given the diverse sources of data feeds that you're just talking about, right, like transactional and internal DBs, how do you see like web scraping fitting into this broader spectrum? And like what are the focus, like can you focus on the benefits and can you share some real world examples where or maybe a blueprint of a generic web data business case and like a checklist of what one needs to follow? And
so we built so during the interviews, obviously we're talking to people about stuff that's sensitive information, so we always make sure, you know, they don't don't share anything that's sensitive or confidential. Well, we did ask about business cases, and we asked about, do you do them? If it was yes, okay, could you give us an outline of what the headings were? Just so we want to understand what the headings were. And a few of them, you know, the shared contents page or screenshot contents page, or talk us through it, especially the process that went around it. So we were very grateful for that. And we took those headings, and whilst a lot of them are obviously typical business case headings, some of the order and structure was quite interesting. And one or two of the points I thought, okay, that's fairly web scraping specific. Obviously, we'll be sharing these slides so you get this content structure as well. Because what made it quite interesting, so your standard business case, the headings, executive summary, project description, business needs and opportunity, project objectives. So right now, these are very descriptive. It's all about effectively talking it out. And the reason why that's important, or how that really helps, is to zone in on the uncertainty, which is around the assumptions, the dependencies. Again, assume you can get this data. If a human can get to the website and look at it, just assume you can get that data. Maybe there might be challenges, but they can be overcome. The real uncertainty was around the benefits. That's what we found. And actually, by having these very descriptive parts up front about what's the business need, what's the opportunity, to fill that out, you needed input from the commercial people. The developers, the people writing, the web scraping engineers or data scientists couldn't fill this out. So by virtue of having the business case, even if you have this just as a checklist and it's a bullet point list underneath it, it forces a tighter integration between the commercial sponsor, so the organized group, department or person or team that are going to benefit from this data, and the people who are acquiring the data and piping the data into the organization. So by virtue of having these, it forces that communication, forces information to be documented, and it helps the developers understand, okay, well, you only need that information, you don't need that information, so I can reduce your cost by not going and getting additional properties or delivery information, which might be extra clicks, as an example. I know I'm leaning very heavily on the e-commerce examples because often it's one that people can relate to quite easily. But having all these kind of more talk side, more qualitative stuff up front, it makes it easier then to pull out, okay, well, these are the expected benefits that we'd see. Next slide, we'll dig into the benefits a bit more and how you actually might quantify them. And of course, the risks and mitigation, and then, as I mentioned, legal and ethical compliance. So even just having these as a checklist of, have I looked at these, would be very useful. On the financial analysis side then, estimating the actual project costs, to be honest, this should be quite straightforward, either from your own experience and extrapolating from that, or working with organizations like Zyte to just give us a guideline, give us some rules of thumb, which we can easily provide. Actually, I'll show you one later on, a very easy one to use. The expected return on investment, which is, you already have the benefits, you have the costs, and just dividing one to the other to find out what the ROI is. And with the break-even analysis, the important part of that is kind of the timelines, like how, okay, yes, you will get a benefit, but if it's going to take 3 years to get it, a lot could change in 3 years. And that's a very, very long time for web scraping projects to deliver value. When we're looking at price intelligence projects, looking at delivering value within a month or two, really fast turnaround in price intelligence. Other ones might take a bit longer if they're making like long-term decisions or strategic decisions or regards market entry, product category expansion, etc. Timeline, stakeholder analysis, that was an interesting one as well. Stakeholder analysis, because there were often other teams inside companies that should have been consulted or could have really helped, particularly these days now as we get more and more companies have their own kind of data stewards or chief data officers. And if they're making sure they're part of the project as well, making sure they have oversight, that they can feed into us, because perhaps you want to get this data and you might be looking at this data, okay, this is price intelligence, but that very same data could be mined for huge potential by other organizations, other groups within your organization. So if your data is feed into a data lake, or if it meets internal standards, it can be very beneficial to the whole company. So it's always good to think beyond your immediate use case or your immediate benefits. All the people, especially data scientists, will find a way of getting value from the data. So I'm just thinking there, one of the interesting points that was pointed out to us was that when we asked about business cases, often we'd be told we don't do business cases, but we have a data feed backlog of different feeds that we want acquired. They used to joke that, at least two of them are joking, that the size of the backlog was directly proportionate to the number of data scientists. So if you hired more data scientists to reduce your backlog, it actually just increased your backlog because they had more and more requests. So another point that came up was alternatives considered, which was interesting. And this is around, can you just buy the data, buy an older set of data, if it's not informing immediate decisions, or if it's data that's a month old about going to a new market, that's going to be okay. But it's looking at, what are your alternatives? Can you even get by maybe with some synthetic data? Can you seed with some real data and generate synthetic data, as an example? So asking those questions like, do we have to get web data? Okay, if we do, how often do we need it? How fresh does it have to be? how representative does it have to be, etc. There were some really interesting points in that in terms of, rather than just go, if you ask web data engineers, of course they're going to say, of course we go to the web and get it. Maybe there are alternatives. I know it sounds strange coming from us, Zyte, saying this, but ultimately we want to see our clients succeed, and that means, and ultimately mean more success for us in the long run. And then capturing the recommendation, the conclusion, and the approval. So it's a high level kind of business case. And we share these points, but even though it seems very heavy on descriptive at the start, that is purposeful to drive the collaboration between the people getting the data and the people who will extract the value from the data, and to also, what are the assumptions, what are dependencies. And then looking, let's see, what we did is we wanted to look at the on the financial side, kind of give so that last business case headings, very good, exhaustive, covers everything. Not that we should do that every single time for every single data feed. It's again about being proportionate. So if you think of an initial kind of, okay, well, how would we have an idea for checking, if we're getting some web data and a benefit, what would we do? Just very quickly, and this can be back in napkin, to find out, what you want to find out is how much analysis you do, what is proportionate. So straight off, starting defining clear commercial objectives. So if you're doing a market intelligence, you want to find out how well certain categories are selling for competitors, and how does that compare to yourselves. So defining clear commercial objectives, identify key performance indicators. So what are the actual measures that we're looking for? And the measures could be, if you're targeting a site that has in-stock numbers, for example, for product categories, how much do our different competitors have in stock? How is that changing over time? How is it compared to our own? What are your actual KPIs then around that? So actually getting down to the brass tacks, getting down to the numbers, estimating potential benefits. So again, if you're working closely with your commercial people, you should be able to get a good handle around that. It's unlikely a particular web scraping project within the broad remit of a company is going to double your revenue overnight. So there's bounds of reality and what's achievable, and how much it might change revenue, increase revenue, or increase customer retention. So if you imagine it's how are you going to move the dial, and getting the commercial people's insights as to what's the absolute best case, and what the worst case. The worst case is, at the very least, you just spent the money and got nothing. But what's the best case? And then kind of getting a good estimate is, well, what do you think is realistic, and how can we test this quickly? Where are the biggest assumptions? You'll find often the assumptions aren't around, the biggest risks, sorry, aren't around getting the data or not getting the data. It's, can we get the value out of it? Estimating the costs. I'll show you a quick example in a minute how you can do that quite easily and quite transparently. Again, simple ROI, and comparing the ROI then against internal benchmarks, which is what we heard from a few companies, was they have their own internal measures of what good looks like. You might have to hear that in terms of, it could be for large projects, often the internal rate of return. In this case, it was ROI in previous projects. And this is where the corporate knowledge, tracking these business cases and going back, what was the forecast, what was the actual, how does it compare, what's good, what's not good, and then to help inform future decision making. Like, okay, well, in the past where we had an ROI above this number, we tended to go ahead and was successful. So that's why it's really important to kind of have a process that it goes through. It doesn't have to be very heavyweight, but as long as it's kind of consistent and you can benchmark and track over time, if that makes sense. Again, then determining the level of analysis required to continue. If this is mission critical, if this is powering a new product, then you need to be careful. You need to go a step through this carefully and make sure you're right. Dispose a little bit of analysis. Looking at the costs at this level, you might decide, what, I'll just do a sampling approach. We'll just go to a few pages. We'll just get the first 100 pages from these sites, and that'll be enough to tell us. Or we'll do a discovery crawl as example. Hope that makes sense. So now you mentioned there about a kind of a more practical example. So what I want to do is take what we talked about in terms of the business case and apply it to price intelligence, kind of return on investment analysis. And this again is coming from our research. So you've been tasked with doing price intelligence for an e-commerce company, and you have a product catalog. It could be 10,000. It could be, sorry, Naya.
Sorry to stop you in between.
Oh no, please.
Before you move on to this, I really want to ask the audience, I'm launching another poll. I want to ask them, how many websites do they typically extract data from, right? And roughly how many requests do they typically make per month? And I know, before you move on, you're going to condense the entire points that we have discussed about the planning and designing part of the maturity model. But like I just want to touch base upon like the intangibles and the uncertainty. Like even though you plan so much and design, uh there is a lot of uncertainty because there are things that are not in your control. There must be change in website structure. Like what is that one thing that you can do to deal with that uncertainty? Can
Oh,
you
it's easy. Hire Zyte. But no, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. I would say there is uncertainty, and that's our job. We deal with that every single day. But in the main, it can nearly always be overcome. It may cost more. There may be more inconvenience. There may be more things to do. But on the cost side, whilst there is uncertainty, I would say it's bounded. In that there's an upper price in terms of how much things cost how much it will cost to get data from a particular website. So whilst there can be uncertainty, there are bounds to it. And in fact, it's separate, but we actually incorporate that into our pricing model where we have tiers. We put websites into different tiers. So you actually see what those bounds are, and you can see, oh, that site's really easy, ergo, it's also very cheap. And then our sites are more expensive. They might need residential, they might need browser rendering, they might need advanced capabilities. We won't go into in this call to get it, and that's at a higher tier price. So it actually helps people with business cases as well, so they can understand, okay, well, what's the split of my data feeds between different tiers. The most uncertainty we found is on extracting the benefit, because all the analysis and thought and thinking and worry and concerns was around getting banned, losing data feeds, which is understandable. That's what data engineers should be focused out or worried about. But it was really the risk that we saw in terms of the number of cancellations was on, yeah, we got the data, it worked fine, but we didn't get the value out of it. We couldn't make the inferences we wanted to make, or the data just wasn't there. It was always on the commercial side where we've got the data, but yeah, turns out changing our product pricing 1 or 2% had very little impact. As an example, again, it'll depend. It's each one is business case specific and client specific and use case specific. But I would say, and this is by the admission of the interviewees, that yeah, that probably could have been avoided. Not always. Sometimes they were stung by costs being higher than they expected, particularly if they were targeting an exotic site that had multiple clicks to get data and multiple requirements. But often it really was on the whole side of getting the value out. Can we infer, is this a good market for us to go into? Can we actually get enough information to infer that decision or not? And that wasn't that clear at times.
Yeah. So just to summarize, just be clear in advance, like what value you want to extract out of the data.
Yeah. A good way to think about it is like, imagine you already have the data, pretend you have it. Okay. And then you go back to, if you can have synthetic data, or buy an old 2-year-old set of data and give it to, say, a scientist. Okay, it's 2 years old, but the maths should still work fine. The regression models still work fine. Go check, go validate. Can we actually make these decisions on the basis of historical data? Find a way to validate it without going and building all the data feeds and putting all the QA and processing and pipelines in place. How can you actually test this quickly? It's even quite easy for anybody to spin up some synthetic data in Excel, just to how will this work?
Yeah,
that's something we should do.
Guys, I know we are running a bit over time, but then James, can you quickly cover this, and then we'll head to Q&A.
Yeah. So on the price intelligence side, you're looking at it, and you have a full product catalog. It could be 10,000 products, it could be 10 million products. And this, again, is from real feedback during the interview process. And if you're looking at price intelligence, the first thing you're going to do is look at, okay, well, what are the main revenue generators of your product categories and your product lines? Where is the bulk of your revenue coming from? And it's always going to be a Pareto principle, or a lot of your revenue or profit is from particular categories. So then you isolate down. So I'm going from a very large set of products that I might have to scrape from competitors to, well, okay, these are the ones that move the dial. So let's focus on them first. But then even within that, you have price sensitive products. So these ones are typically daily staples, milk, bread, butter, where people kind of know, I know what the price is, and if it varies by 2 or 3 cents, I actually will go somewhere else to shop, or I will buy somewhere else. It's stuff that people tend to be quite price sensitive on. And then you also have products that are kind of price insensitive. Like, I'm not sure many people could answer here very quickly. How much does your average corner leather suite cost? I mean, you're actually might be plus or minus $500 as an example. So there's two ends of that, the price sensitive and the price insensitive, and both are quite important for price intelligence. So the price sensitive, you might have a corporate mission of, okay, we want to be in the lowest quartile all the time. So that means moving for the staples, for the price sensitive products, moving that price so you retain your market share. So that's on the defensive side. On the more offensive, or as they call it, the euphemism for it was called was a profit management, I think is how a few companies called it. On the price incentive side, basically making sure you're not leaving revenue on the table. So now you've gone from a very large set of products down to, okay, well, these are the ones I need to scrape, and this is why I need to scrape them. And if the people doing the web scraping understand it, it really helps them understand what do I need to target and why and how often. And even within these two subsets, it's going to be the products that have the highest price point that will have the highest impact by moving. If you're moving their price point, if they're already highly priced, it's going to have an impact on a bigger impact rather than lower priced items. So very quickly, you've moved right down. So we had a client who, let's say, for anonymity purposes, was in the top 5 e-commerce companies in the US. They had, at the time, around 5 million products. And they started their price intelligence, their first web scraping project, with just 1,000 products. And that's where it validated the business case. They got immediate benefits on it. And it paved the way for expansion to that and expanding the product range. But it was diminishing returns after that, once they actually nailed the first 1,000. And they just picked a round number of 1,000 to kind of, we went through this logic, and this is where this logic came from. And it repeated itself in different guises and different companies. Where should we do the web scraping? Think of it in terms of what's the least amount of web scraping you can do, so you're getting value and you can validate it. Because if you're dealing with 1,000 records at a time, that's much easier to process, to maintain, to do QA on, to check things on, to experiment with. So how can you get that instant value and really control the value of it? So that's on the ROI, on the benefit side. And of course, the maths around the benefit here is quite simple. You have the revenue point for each of these, or the price point for each of these products, and by moving the price X 3, 4, 5, 10%, whatever it might be, what the revenue impact will be for the organization. So it should be relatively straightforward for a commercial person to kind of go, look, if our price intelligence allows us to increase prices by 5%, that's the impact. So it's quite straightforward on the benefit side. That's just an example. The logic will often apply to other areas as well. On the cost side, I mentioned, of course, has to be plugged for ourselves, but we have, I would actually mention someone else if they had this too, but I don't know anyone who has this. So on our platform, if you're a customer, or indeed if you're a trialer, if you're trying the platform, you have access to a calculator where you simply put in the websites that you care about. You put in the amount of requests per month you're expecting, and we'll actually tell you, okay, well, that's a tier 1, it's cheap. That's a tier 5, that's a bit more expensive. And you can get it'll instantly tell you, okay, that's how much that'll cost you per month. So you can give it's much easier these days to get a solid, reliable price for how much a web scraping project cost you. So that's why I mentioned there's a lot less uncertainty there than maybe there has been. And if we're giving you a price in here, we know it works. Put it that way. So sorry, it was a bit fast to get through that there, Naya, but I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. So we have a really interesting question. In the Q&A. Would you include cost of maintenance in the planning stage, and how to think about it?
Oh, really definitely. No, definitely include that, because it's one of the biggest limitations to scaling within a company is at the start, when people are at early stages, they build feeds, and it's like, oh, it's broken, need to fix that. And their ability to add new feeds, it just diminishes and diminishes over time, because now it's spending all their time maintaining. And maintenance, it's not sexy. No one goes to college to learn how to become a web data feed maintainer, in all honesty. So it's hard to attract those people, hard to get people, but it's the non-sexy work. Building data feeds is the fun, interesting work and challenges. So it's not something that is top of mind, but it can be, it's expensive if you don't plan for it. Like that's in Zyte, we have dedicated teams, that's their only job. They focus on that and the monitoring around it. You definitely need to plan for it, because it's more in terms of it's a ceiling. You're going to hit a ceiling that once you have a certain amount of data feeds, either your quality is going to suffer, or you just won't be able to add new feeds because you spend all your time fighting fires with the ones you've already put in place, and won't allow you to put kind of robust processes in place. And it's obviously more expensive set up these processes and get all these monitoring in place, tools in place, and have the dedicated teams. Like you may have build teams, but then you have to have the maintenance teams. And it's a very different mindset as well in terms of in the maintenance side than is on the build side. So it's different skill sets as well. They're both doing the code, both using Python or whatever you're using, but it's different skill sets, different capabilities. So yes, absolutely you need to include for that. Because as you saw in the benchmark survey, the scaling and maintenance is not as good as the build, and it's a big driver for people coming to us as well in terms of they're having problems scaling. They can't get the volumes, they can't get the reliability. They're able to build it, but it's the on the maintenance is where the issues are. And typically it could be around getting bans because your target website's changing. It's not a static one build and hope for the best. Did that answer the question? I can't see the questions myself, so I hope that's answered.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how to pronounce name. It's Asikul. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Does that answer your question? Can you let us know in the chat? And yeah. So we have a couple of questions in the chat window. Okay, one question in the chat. Do you only scrape website data? Oh, she's saying like he or she. I'm sorry. Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, we have a question. Do you only scrape website data, or can you do YouTube videos as well as other platforms? I'm not sure. What do you mean by that, Kamal?
Well, actually, one thing just to know for videos, often with the videos, there's a lot of metadata with them. There can be a lot of platforms that will actually have the captions as well that you can access that. So it's not a case that you have to process the video and run through machine learning to extract the content. A lot of the content can be there. It may not be obvious on the page, but there are a lot of platforms where, yeah, you can get the data, you can get a lot of the content, you can get a lot of the meta information from the meta file on particular videos. You can, obviously there's a lot of services to convert a video to text, but if you're smart, you know the sites, you can find a way of getting some of the captions already or enough to inform. It'll depend on your use case, of course, and what you're trying to achieve. Obviously these sites can be scraped and there are means and ways of extracting data from videos, but doing it each video, processing each one like 1 second at a time, extracting data, that's very expensive. There's no cheap way around that. This is why you try to get the data, get your information kind of from the text if at all can, if you have an HTML or from meta files around it. That would be most advisable, because it is, yeah, we've talked with and worked with companies who kind of specialize in that area, and it's a one-to-one in terms of the need to run the video, let's say for 1 second, analysis for 1 second to extract information from the video. So you're much better off getting the information from the text. Graphics, yeah, absolutely. That's machine learning does that fantastically. So pictures, image, optical, from everything from optical character recognition to machine learning and vision technology on pages, which is stuff we use ourselves all the time. So if it's on the page, if you can see it, yeah, you can extract information. But the images be much easier, much cheaper than videos. Hope that answers your question, Kamal.
Yeah. We have one more question. How do you handle the fact that the businesses depend on the website front end code that changes very often?
Yeah, it depends. So I mentioned earlier on about redundancy. So let's say we'd have web data feeds, which you might write like what I might call a hard-coded spider, where you're pointing to a particular tag, so a particular place on the page, you know, go to this href and pull out this information. And the site could be doing their own SEO and optimization, and they're moving things around the page, and that will break. And that's where, for us, our vision system kicks in, our machine learning, which will look at the page and go, it doesn't care where the price is on the page. It figures out that's the price over there. It doesn't matter that it moved. So that's where the machine learning and the vision systems really kick in there. You can have, as I say, the hard coded, where it's pointing to the actual reference, and you can detect that it's broken and fix it, and that it works. It's cost effective if you have a team dedicated to that and responding really, really quickly, and you have really good monitoring on it. But you also can have the fallback to machine learning, where, okay, well, it doesn't matter where it is in the page, the vision system will figure out that is the price, or that is the shipping information, or that is the videos associated with the product, for example. Hope that answers your question.
Okay. We don't have any more questions. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining in, and thank you, James, for this. you want to talk through it? You do want to talk through the next steps?
Yeah, I suppose we've shared the self-assessment in the chat. It'll be sent on probably afterwards as well, the link to the recording. It's just, do the self-assessment if there's particular things that you want to do a deeper dive on, because again, the self-assessment, we had to kind of simplify it a small bit. Obviously there's much more depth behind it, or we go into real specifics and specific data types. Just for today, I kept it e-commerce just to keep it consistent. And you'll get back your score and the benchmark, and where we have enough of a sample in terms of industry representatives or use types, like high-end fashion or particular pet food, whatever it might be. If we have enough of a statistical sample, we'll actually get back to, okay, well, here you are against the general population, and because you're high-end, here you're high-end fashion, here's how you compare against other high-end fashion providers, if that makes sense. Yeah, and you can sorry,
Sorry, we have a couple of more questions. Do you want to take it now, or shall we just answer in the email? Martin.
Time. We have another minute left.
Yeah.
There's a question there. Are we using residential? We do and we can. I would say the main thing is a client doesn't have to worry. So whether you're using our software, you don't need to go in and tell the use residential. It'll figure out, like for Zyte API, it'll figure out if I need residential or not, because it might figure with some websites, you need residential for the first request, but for the next 6. There's other ways of, and Zyte API automatically looks after all that. It figures out what's the optimum to keep the cost down low. So taking the complexity out of it. Otherwise, you're going off to different providers, and I want data center proxies, I want residential proxies, and I drive all these requests through the residential. Very expensive, especially if you're rendering on top of that again in terms of the gigabytes that you're driving through it. So certainly we do use them, but I would say we use them smart, so as to minimize the cost. Actually, it's really interesting. I don't know if anyone has it there. Proxyway did an analysis of the industry. It's kind of an independent consultancy. Who unfortunately don't take any bribes or anything. I know they're very good. They analyzed ourselves and 4 other competitors, and it was published there 2 weeks ago. Yeah, and we came out really well. But we came out really well because a fortune of work has gone into building an amazing product in terms of Zyte API and what it's capable of. I'm sure you've covered it in your own webinars, but yeah, it's really impressive.
Yeah.
You might share the link to the Proxyway report as well in the email.
Yeah. So we'll do that. And you can also send your questions to us. Take the self-assessment test, and we'll reach out to you. And then next thing, so thank you all for joining in today, and thank you, James, for covering in, and thank you, Kleber, for setting this webinar up for us. So we have talked about everything in this webinar today, ROI analysis on the planning and the design part of it, from inception to conclusion. And in the context of web scraping, now how often do stakeholders underestimate or overlook the legal and ethical compliance segment, and how does that impact the project's overall success and ROI? We will see that in the next episode. So stay tuned for this series. And do send us questions beforehand. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions when you take the self-assessment test, and you will know where you are in maturity level depending on the results. So do collect your questions, send us to us, and participate in the next webinar, which will be specifically talking about legal and ethical compliance segment. So thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, see you next time.